Ladies and gentlemen, let me begin with an observation that is both simple and slightly uncomfortable. In modern society, millions of intelligent, hardworking, middle-class people remain financially stressed for most of their lives. Not because they lack opportunity and not because they are incapable of earning good money, but because they repeatedly fall into a set of predictable money traps. What makes this interesting is that most of these traps are socially approved. They look respectable. They feel normal. In fact, many of them are encouraged by culture, advertising, and sometimes even by well-meaning financial advice. So people do what everyone else is doing. They work hard, they earn, they spend, they borrow, they upgrade their lifestyle every few years, and then 30 years later, they look around and wonder why financial freedom never arrived. Now, I have spent a long time observing human behavior, and one thing becomes very clear after a while. Most financial outcomes are not driven by intelligence. They are driven by behavior. Finance is actually quite simple mathematically. You earn money, you spend some of it, you save and invest the rest. Over time, the invested money compounds. That's not a complicated equation. What makes it difficult is human psychology. People are emotional, social, impatient creatures, and the modern economy has become extremely good at exploiting those tendencies. So today I want to talk about the quiet money traps that keep the middle class stuck. Not because they are foolish people, but because they are human. And once you see these traps clearly, you start to notice them everywhere. The first trap is lifestyle inflation. Lifestyle inflation is the tendency for spending to rise automatically as income rises. A young professional begins with a modest lifestyle because they have no choice. They rent a small place. They drive a simple car. They cook at home. They are careful with money. Then the income begins to grow. Suddenly the apartment gets upgraded. The car becomes newer. Dining out becomes routine. Vacations become more elaborate. Subscriptions multiply. Gadgets become more frequent. None of these decisions feels extravagant individually. In fact, each one feels deserved. I worked hard for this. And of course that is true. But the mathematics of lifestyle inflation are ruthless. Wealth is created by the gap between income and expenses. When income rises but expenses rise equally fast, the gap never grows. Imagine someone who earns $50,000 and spends $45,000. They save $5,000. 10 years later, they earn $100,000 but spend $95,000. On paper, their income doubled. In reality, their financial life barely improved. This pattern is astonishingly common. People feel richer each year, but they are no closer to financial independence. They are simply living at a higher altitude on the same treadmill. Another trap is the obsession with looking successful. Human beings evolved in tribes. Status mattered for survival. Even today, people constantly measure themselves against others. Unfortunately, modern consumer culture has turned status into a financial arms race. People feel pressure to display success through visible symbols, cars, houses, vacations, clothing, gadgets. But signaling wealth and building wealth are two completely different activities. In fact, they often move in opposite directions. The person driving the luxury car with the expensive watch may actually have very little net worth. Meanwhile, the quiet neighbor driving an ordinary vehicle may have a large investment portfolio quietly compounding in the background. Real wealth is invisible. It is not the car in the driveway, it is the financial assets that allow you to live without depending entirely on a paycheck. But society trains people to prioritize visible success instead of invisible stability. And this leads directly into another major trap, consumer debt. Debt has become normalized to an extraordinary degree. Many middle-class households operate with multiple layers of borrowing at the same time. There may be student loans, car loans, credit card balances, personal loans, and mortgages. Each one may seem manageable individually, but collectively they create a structure in which a large portion of income is permanently committed to monthly payments. Debt is essentially a claim on your future time. Every payment represents hours of your future labor already promised to someone else. And when a person accumulates too many of these obligations, financial flexibility disappears. An unexpected expense becomes a crisis. A job loss becomes catastrophic. Opportunities that require risk, starting a business, changing careers, moving cities, become impossible because the debt obligations must still be paid. Consumer debt, especially high-interest credit card debt, is particularly destructive because it compounds against you instead of for you. Compound interest is a wonderful thing when you are earning it. It is a terrible thing when you are paying it. Another trap that keeps many people stuck is the pursuit of financial shortcuts. People naturally prefer fast results over slow ones. Unfortunately, wealth building is usually a slow process. It involves consistent saving, sensible investing, and a long time horizon. But because that process feels boring, people search for exciting alternatives. They chase the latest investment craze. They speculate in assets they barely understand. They attempt day trading. They follow charismatic financial personalities promising extraordinary returns. This rarely ends well. Markets have a way of humbling people who believe they have discovered easy money. The irony is that the most effective investment strategy for most people is astonishingly simple. Invest regularly in diversified assets and allow time to do the heavy lifting. Compounding works quietly but powerfully. Over decades, even modest returns can produce significant wealth if they are not interrupted by emotional decisions or speculative gambles. But patience is unpopular. So many people sabotage compounding by constantly jumping in and out of investments. They buy when excitement is high and prices are elevated. They sell when fear is high and prices are depressed. This pattern repeats across market cycles with astonishing consistency. Another trap lies in confusing income with wealth. Income is important, of course, but income alone does not create financial security. You can earn a large salary and still be financially fragile if your spending rises to match it. Meanwhile, someone earning a more modest income but saving aggressively can accumulate substantial wealth over time. Income is a stream, wealth is a reservoir, and the size of the reservoir depends on how much water you allow to accumulate. Unfortunately, many people focus almost entirely on increasing their income while paying very little attention to managing their expenses. They assume that future raises will solve their financial problems, but without behavioral changes, higher income simply enables higher spending. Another trap involves housing decisions. Home ownership is often presented as the cornerstone of financial success, and for some families it works very well. But many buyers approach housing emotionally rather than rationally. They purchase homes that stretch their finances to the limit. They underestimate maintenance costs, property taxes, insurance, and opportunity costs. The house becomes a financial burden rather than a stable foundation. A large mortgage consumes cash flow that could otherwise be invested. And because housing expenses are fixed and long-term, they reduce flexibility. Financial flexibility is one of the most underrated advantages in life. The ability to move, change careers, start businesses, or weather difficult periods is enormously valuable. But flexibility disappears when a large percentage of income is permanently committed to fixed expenses. Another subtle but costly trap is the neglect of financial education. Many people spend years mastering professional skills, yet devote almost no time to understanding how money works. They can be excellent engineers, doctors, managers, or teachers, yet basic financial concepts remain unfamiliar. As a result, they rely heavily on advice from people whose incentives may not align with their interests. But the fundamentals of personal finance are not terribly complicated. Understanding compounding, diversification, inflation, taxes, and risk can dramatically improve financial decision-making. A few good books and thoughtful habits can prevent decades of expensive mistakes. Another trap that deserves attention is emotional investing. Financial markets fluctuate constantly. Prices rise and fall, sometimes dramatically, but volatility is normal. Unfortunately, many investors treat market declines as emergencies. When prices fall, they panic. When prices rise rapidly, they become overly optimistic. This emotional cycle leads to poor timing decisions. They sell during downturns when fear dominates. Then they buy back later when optimism returns and prices are already higher. In effect, they systematically sell low and buy high. Successful investing does not require extraordinary intelligence. It requires emotional discipline. The ability to remain calm when markets are volatile is far more valuable than predicting short-term price movements. Another trap is procrastination. People frequently postpone saving and investing because they believe they will start later when their income increases or their circumstances stabilize. But time is the most valuable ingredient in compounding. The difference between starting at 25 versus 35 can be enormous. Compounding is like planting trees. The earlier you plant them, the more time they have to grow. Unfortunately, many people delay planting those trees until much later in life, when the growth potential is already reduced. Finally, there is a broader philosophical trap, the belief that financial independence requires extraordinary brilliance or rare luck. In reality, the formula is remarkably straightforward. Earn a reasonable income, spend less than you earn, invest the difference consistently, allow time and compounding to do their work. None of this requires genius. What it requires is discipline, patience, and the willingness to think independently, rather than simply copying the financial behavior of the crowd. And that is harder than it sounds, because the crowd often appears confident and successful even when it is heading in the wrong direction. But if you study history carefully, you will notice something important. Financial success is rarely the result of dramatic breakthroughs. More often, it is the result of quietly avoiding the mistakes that trap everyone else. Avoid excessive lifestyle inflation, avoid consumer debt, avoid chasing status, avoid speculative shortcuts, avoid emotional reactions to market noise, avoid postponing the power of compounding. If you simply avoid these traps, you will find yourself far ahead of the majority of people. And that brings me to one of my favorite observations about success in general. It often comes not from brilliance, but from consistently avoiding stupidity. The world is full of highly intelligent individuals who sabotage their own financial lives through impatience, comparison, and impulsive decisions. Meanwhile, the person who behaves rationally, who saves steadily, invests patiently, and resists social pressure, often achieves extraordinary results, not because they discovered a secret formula, but because they allowed simple principles to operate for a very long time. Over decades, those principles compound, and eventually something remarkable happens. Money stops being a constant source of anxiety. Instead of controlling your life, it becomes a tool that provides choices. The choice to pursue meaningful work rather than merely necessary work. The choice to spend time with family, to explore interests, to contribute to causes you care about. In other words, the ultimate goal of financial discipline is not wealth for its own sake. It is freedom from constant financial pressure, freedom from dependence on circumstances you cannot control, freedom to live deliberately rather than reactively. And the fascinating thing is that this freedom does not require extraordinary wealth. It simply requires avoiding the traps that quietly keep so many people stuck. Do that consistently, year after year, decade after decade, and you will find that financial independence is not a distant miracle. It is simply the natural result of rational behavior practiced for a very long time. And if you found these ideas useful, I'd encourage you to keep learning, keep questioning conventional financial habits, and subscribe or follow this channel for more conversations about money, investing, and rational decision-making.